People do not change because you beg them to. They do not transform simply because you have suffered enough, loved enough, waited enough, or explained enough. Real change happens only when a person becomes internally ready for it, when their own habits begin to feel heavy on their conscience, when their own choices start to burden them in a way they can no longer ignore. Human beings rarely shift because their actions wound others. More often, they change only when the cost of remaining the same becomes unbearable to themselves. This is a difficult truth to face, especially when your heart is invested in someone, especially when part of you still believes that if you are patient enough, kind enough, loyal enough, they will finally become who you have hoped they could be. And yet, so many of us live in this waiting. We wait in silence. We wait with hope. We wait while shaping our days, our emotions, and our futures around someone else's timeline, someone else's awakening, someone else's decision to mature, to understand, to care, or to change. We stretch ourselves around possibilities. We postpone peace because we are still negotiating with potential. But Stoicism reminds us of something sobering and liberating at once. Reality is indifferent. It does not bend itself to desire. It does not reorganize itself because our intentions are pure or our emotions are deep. What lies outside our control is not ours to repair by force, and no amount of emotional investment can turn another person's unwillingness into genuine transformation. What belongs to us is smaller, but far more powerful. What belongs to us is our response, our judgment, our composure, the steadiness we maintain in the presence of uncertainty, the integrity with which we navigate disappointment, the discipline to see clearly when illusion is tempting. This is not easy. In fact, it can be profoundly painful to realize that loving someone deeply does not grant you authority over their becoming. Care does not equal control. Devotion does not create leverage. Wanting the best for someone does not mean you can lead them there before they choose that path for themselves. The temptation, of course, is to cling, to hold tightly to what might be, to imagine a future version of someone and begin relating to that imagined self rather than the person who is standing before you now. We do this because possibility is intoxicating. It offers relief from present disappointment. It allows us to remain emotionally invested while postponing the moment of truth. But wisdom asks something more difficult of us. Wisdom asks us to observe without projection, to witness patterns without rewriting them in our minds, to stop decorating reality with hope and begin seeing it with clarity. True clarity emerges only when we are willing to confront patterns as they actually are, not as we explain them away, not as we soften them out of love, not as we defend them because we are afraid of what they mean, but as they are. And within that clarity, something surprising begins to appear. Freedom. Freedom to act with intention instead of desperation. Freedom to establish boundaries without guilt. Freedom to honor your own well-being without resentment. Freedom to stop confusing endurance with virtue. It is in the quiet acceptance of what is that real strength begins to form. A disciplined mind does not seek its power in managing other people. It does not waste itself trying to engineer someone else's awakening. A steady mind, aware and deliberate, finds strength in maintaining its own center. It draws power from equilibrium. Every decision made with reason and reflection reinforces the kind of life one wishes to live, grounded in reality, guided by virtue, and aligned with values that do not depend on anyone else's cooperation. This is where Stoic strength lives, not in domination, not in persuasion, but in self-command. Think then about the patterns you have observed, not the speeches, not the apologies, not the passionate declarations made in moments of emotion. Think instead of the behaviors that repeat quietly and consistently over time. We are often captivated by words because words are immediate and warm. They flatter our hope. They create movement where there may be none. But words drift easily. They dissolve like smoke. What remains is behavior. What repeats in silence is far more revealing than what is spoken in intensity. Character is rarely exposed in grand statements. It is revealed in repeated action. Notice the small gestures that often go unseen, the choices people make when there is no applause, no reward, no audience. Notice what happens when convenience disappears, when comfort is interrupted, when effort is required. These are the moments that reveal priorities. These are the places where intention meets reality. Stoicism teaches that action carries greater truth than rhetoric ever can. In repeated choices, the structure of character becomes visible. In patterns, not promises, we discover who someone truly is. Repetition uncovers values more honestly than language ever will. Consistency shows where energy is invested, what is protected, what is nourished, and what is left to decay. A person's real priorities are not hidden in mystery, they are quietly displayed in what they repeatedly choose. The missed calls, the broken commitments, the recurring excuses, the same apologies attached to the same unchanged habits. Each one, in isolation, may seem small, but over time they are woven together into something undeniable. They become a portrait, a map, a revelation of the deeper architecture of character. And still, it is tempting to rationalize, to say they are tired, to say life is hard, to say they have a lot on their mind, to say this is just a phase. Sometimes those things are true, but repeated choices cannot be permanently explained away by temporary circumstances. When the same behavior persists, it carries meaning. It tells you whether someone contributes to your peace or slowly destabilizes it. It tells you whether your trust is being honored or eroded. It tells you whether your emotional world is being respected or quietly exhausted. Hope often stands between us and reality. It presents itself as something noble, and at times it is. But unchecked hope can become distortion. It can persuade us to keep investing in what has not yet shown evidence of becoming. It can turn potential into a kind of emotional currency, causing us to spend ourselves on futures that exist only in imagination. We begin measuring progress by what we long for, rather than what is actually happening. And in doing so, we lose contact with the truth. Stoicism offers a corrective. Reality is indifferent to our preferences. The world does not reorganize itself around longing. Judgment must therefore be aligned with what exists, not with what would comfort us. This alignment preserves both clarity and integrity. To see clearly is not to become cold or cynical. It is to become honest. It is to stop asking reality to disguise itself for the sake of your feelings. It is to understand that observation, not wishful thinking, is the beginning of wisdom. Recognizing patterns requires discipline because it asks you to remain attentive when emotional attachment wants to blur the evidence. Every repeated action is information. Every cycle teaches something. When you observe carefully, you gain insight not only into another person, but also into the consequences of continuing to invest where inconsistency persists. To tolerate unreliability because of attachment is to slowly surrender your own well-being. At first, the surrender feels minor, a little extra patience, a little more understanding, a little more room for disappointment. But over time, repeated exposure to inconsistency wears something down within you. Confidence weakens, emotional strain grows, standards soften. What once would have felt unacceptable starts to feel normal. This is how inner erosion happens, not dramatically, but gradually,
a subtle redefinition of what you will allow, a quiet accommodation of what once would have violated your peace. Stoic observation interrupts this erosion. It restores discernment by returning you to reason. Instead of reacting impulsively, you begin to interpret clearly. Instead of defending patterns, you begin to read them. This is not hardness, it is maturity. Patterns also reveal the limits of influence. No amount of pleading can manufacture virtues that another person has not chosen. No amount of explaining can substitute for internal willingness. Hope, by itself, cannot accelerate another person's growth. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to this distinction. Wisdom lies in discerning what belongs to our control and what does not. The choices of others fall outside our authority.
To see reality as it is not pessimism. It is preparation. It allows for deliberate action. It keeps us from building our emotional lives on projection. And projection is always tempting, especially when we sense unrealized potential. We imagine who someone might become and begin relating to that possibility more than to the person who actually exists. In doing so, we prioritize our comfort over their autonomy. We want reality to match our hope, and so we begin trying to shape outcomes according to our vision. But Stoicism calls us back to alignment. Perception must remain faithful to reality. Action taken without another person's internal consent cannot cultivate virtue. It can only impose pressure. And pressure often creates resistance, resentment, or dependence. Genuine influence works differently. It operates through example, integrity, environment, and presence. It does not attempt to seize ownership of another person's path. Real responsibility lies closer to home. It lies in preserving your own integrity, in sustaining inner consistency, in keeping your judgment clear, in remaining morally aligned even when circumstances pull at your peace. Your task is not to dictate the trajectories of others. Your task is to live in such a way that your values remain intact, your boundaries remain honest, and your mind remains undivided. That is agency. That is composure. That is Stoic strength. To honor autonomy, your own and that of others, is to preserve dignity. Support can be offered. Care can be extended. Boundaries can be held, but control must be released. Attempting to shape choices beyond your authority undermines peace because it ties your emotional stability to outcomes you do not command. Observing limits restores balance. It reminds you that wisdom is not found in managing people, but in managing yourself. Ultimately, the measure of wisdom lies in where you place your energy. If you place it in fantasies, you become dependent on disappointment. If you place it in observation, principle, and self-respect, you reclaim your agency. Patience becomes noble only when joined with discernment. Reflection becomes powerful when it leads to action. Careful observation allows you to engage with others intentionally rather than reactively. In this way, you maintain composure even in uncertainty. You remain rooted in principle instead of being pulled apart by expectation. By honoring your own boundaries while respecting the autonomy of others, you move through relationships with greater clarity, steadiness, and integrity. Influence becomes ethical only when aligned with reason, never when driven by the need to force or secure a particular result. That is where peace begins, when you stop demanding that life become different before you permit yourself to become clear. It is easy to justify waiting, easy to rationalize, easy to say just a little longer. Each hopeful day can feel like an investment in eventual harmony, a small sacrifice in service of a better future. But every unchanged pattern is also a message. Quiet, repeated, and consistent, it speaks of priorities, values,
willingness, and capacity. The wise observer learns to distinguish between a temporary lapse and a deeply rooted pattern. This is one of the most important forms of discernment, knowing when patience is principled and knowing when it is merely avoidance dressed in virtue. When attention is centered on observable patterns, relationships come into sharper focus. You begin to assess not only the other person's character, but also the impact of their repeated behavior on your own life. This changes everything. Decisions about presence, investment, and emotional exposure no longer emerge from hope alone. They are guided by evidence. Stoic practice encourages exactly this orientation. Respond to what can actually be seen, act with integrity, and preserve internal steadiness even when the external world remains inconsistent. There is dignity in understanding that change must arise from within. There is self-respect in accepting that another person's development cannot be forced by your loyalty. The subtle strength of observing patterns over time is that it gradually replaces confusion with understanding. It settles hope. It quiets projection. It enables the mind to act with greater firmness because it is acting on truth rather than fantasy. And perhaps one of the deepest questions beneath all of this is not only why do I stay, but what inside me keeps needing this to become different. Because often when we cling, we are not merely attached to another person, we are attached to what their transformation would mean for us. We imagine that if they finally become loving, responsible, honest, present, or committed, then something inside us will settle, a wound will close, a fear will quiet, a void will be filled. But this is where attachment becomes especially dangerous. It recruits another person into the role of emotional solution. Stoicism challenges this dynamic at its root. It reminds us that our peace cannot be outsourced. What belongs to us is our clarity, our discipline, our judgment, our character. When we try to shape others in order to soothe ourselves, we lose energy twice, once in the attempt and again in the disappointment. The irony is painful. Our effort to secure peace externally often robs us of it internally. The desire for connection is profoundly human. It can make us endure, forgive, rationalize, and remain long after evidence suggests we should reconsider. But attachment can blur into self-erasure when it is driven by the need for validation, acknowledgement, or emotional reassurance. Small compromises accumulate. Tiny acts of self-abandonment become habits. Eventually, the inner world begins to feel unfamiliar. You may still be present in the relationship, but absent from yourself. This is why reflection matters so much. Ask yourself, what exactly am I protecting by staying? Is it love? Is it loyalty? Or is it fear? Fear of solitude, fear of loss, fear of being wrong, fear of beginning again. Stoic clarity does not condemn these fears, it simply asks that they be seen honestly. Once seen, they lose some of their hidden power, and once they lose that power, choice becomes possible again. To remain or to leave is not merely a practical decision, it is often a moral and psychological one. It asks you whether your endurance is serving virtue or slowly destroying it. It asks whether your patience is aligned with strength or sustained by avoidance. It asks whether your love has remained honest or become entangled with illusion. These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. The unexamined attachment becomes a silent authority over the soul. Control, too, is often disguised. It can look like guidance. It can sound like concern. It can feel in moments like devotion. But much of what we call helping is sometimes an effort to manage our own discomfort through another person's behavior. We want them to improve so that we no longer have to sit with disappointment. We want them to awaken so that our uncertainty does not have to die. We want them to change so that our hope does not have to die. But when influence becomes a tool for emotional self-protection, it ceases to be care in its pure form. Stoicism reminds us that the only real authority we possess is over the mind, our thoughts, judgments, actions, and principles. Everything else stands outside that circle. Trying to reshape someone else without their voluntary participation is like pushing against the current of a river with bare hands. The effort exhausts you, but the current remains itself. Understanding this is not a rejection of compassion, it is a purification of it. Genuine care does not manipulate, it respects autonomy, it listens, it offers support when welcome, it sets boundaries when necessary, it refuses to confuse control with love. Influence is most ethical when it is indirect, through example, calm presence, and consistency of character. It does not impose a narrative on another person's life. It does not demand that their development follow your emotional timetable. It understands that growth is voluntary or it is not growth at all. And then there is the ordinary, the place where truth most reliably appears. We are often seduced by charisma, by extraordinary moments, but ordinary life is the real test of character. Who someone is in the mundane matters far more than who they are in the exceptional. How do they respond when they are tired, irritated, inconvenienced, unobserved? How do they carry responsibility? How do they handle conflict when there is no admiration to win?